Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I'm going to be making a critique on the United States Declaration of Independence, particularly asking the question, was the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States to declare their independence justified? So to do that, I'm of course going to be looking at the text of the United States Declaration of Independence in order to analyze it directly. So here I have a transcript here. So I'm going to read it out. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. All right, so a lot of the thoughts relating to whether this is justified or not is going to depend on what particular views you take concerning political philosophy, particularly in the relation of how realism and liberalism affect your particular viewpoints, and also questions concerning ideas of where power comes from, how authority is justified, and particularly ideas of how justice should be exercised and who has a right to exercise justice. So all those things are coming into play here, and it is of course I think very generous, and I find it agreeable that the United States of America in the Continental Congress here are declaring that they are putting together a reasoned argument for why they are separating themselves from Britain. And it's particularly related to this, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So what they're saying is essentially that they are entitled to be separate and equal by the laws of nature and of nature's God. So it is simultaneously an argument from nature and also an argument from higher authority, that is to say that God entitles them to a separate and equal station. Now, they aren't at this point giving particular reference to which God in particular, because we know that Thomas Jefferson, for one, who was strongly involved in the writing of this, was himself a deist and therefore not in agreement to the general Christian sentiment that was more common among some of the other signers of the Declaration of Independence. However, it is worth noting that the king himself, King George III in this instance, did indeed in his title have the phrasing "by the grace of God," particularly referring to the Christian God. So there is that idea that even though it's not particularly referring to Christianity directly, the idea of the divine right of kings is in the particular context of the British monarchy applied from a Christian standpoint. So I think that's important to point out here, because it's important for jurisprudence and for justification if we are indeed making an argument from a superior ultimate authority, that is to say a God, in concerns to a God, of course, being superior to earthly authorities. But let's move on here. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So what we're getting here is that there are particular truths that the writers of the Declaration of Independence consider to be self-evident, which means that they believe that these truths are true to the degree that they don't have to make a positive argument for them because they should be obvious to anyone immediately, or with a little bit of thought anyway, so that they don't have to be strongly argued for, but instead should be natural positions to take. And therefore, when it concerns questions of, let's say, Occam's razor, although it's not being mentioned here, that this is on one side of it, and that things contrary to these are on the other side of it. Okay. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it is worth noting that this formulation is very similar to one made by John Locke, who is by many believed to be somewhat inspirational to this. However, in his formulation, it was life, liberty, and property. So there's a bit of a disagreement in that. However, it is worth asking, if they say that these are self-evident, that the creation of men, of all men, is equal, and that men are, of course, endowed with particular rights which are unalienable, which means that those rights cannot be removed from such persons, and thirdly, that those particular rights that all men equally have and should not lose are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Okay, so that's the statement. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this is a very big point, because whether or not you agree with this particular point is going to determine whether or not you agree with the idea of rebellion at all. Because if you agree with the idea of consent of the governed, then it makes sense that rebellion should, in theory, in particular cases, be allowable. If you disagree that, then rebellion is generally disallowed. Now, of course, there are other reasons for rebellion other than general discontent that can be put forward. So consent of the governed isn't the only reason for it. However, appealing to consent of the governed implies a lower status quo bias than individuals who reject that principle. Status quo bias, of course, is what I'm referring to, the idea that the current state of things, particularly in concerning governments, should be the same, or whether it should be different, and whether radical modifications are acceptable. People with a high status quo bias will say that it would be wrong to make radical changes that violate the integrity of the system, such as a revolution. But individuals with a low status quo bias are more likely to be in favor of revolution. So this particular point is essentially a linchpin to the entire argument for whether or not revolution should be allowed in the first place. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So, safety and happiness, of course, referring back to life and pursuit of happiness up here. So the argument has a logical flow to it, that if these particular truths of equality and the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are true, and in addition to that, if therefore they are violated, and if government is by consent of the governed, then it makes sense that the people would have a right to alter or to abolish the government and institute a new government. Okay, now next sentence. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So this is, of course, the status quo bias occurring here. However, their limit to the status quo is the violation of the unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's the point where the government has gone too far. And accordingly, all experience have shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So, again, accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So they're saying that many people have an even bigger status quo bias. Many people have a status quo bias that is so strong that even though they suffer, they are not going to overthrow their government. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. So they say that, of course, they aren't quick to simply, for minor reasons and for few reasons, to overthrow their government. But because there has been a long list of abuses and usurpations and problems, and there's a legitimate threat of despotism, that they are now rebelling. And here it says, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So they go on giving now the direct charges made against the King of Great Britain, that he is indeed working to put a tyranny over the states. Now, some people might say, well, a lot of it also has to do with Parliament, and that is true. However, it is worth noting that this is written before 19th century nationalism, where the state is more closely identified with its leader rather than with the people that are constituent to it. So there's a different paradigm compared to contemporary type nationalism. So for those of you who might be confused by this particular statement. So now there is a list of the particular problems that have arisen due to the actions of the king and other agents of the state, such as parliament and generals and admirals and such. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So, no comment on that, but I'm just going to read through these. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of the new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has commanded for others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution and acknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts to prevent legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war on us. So it is worth noting that some of these later points are also referring to things that have begun since 1775, due to the beginning of a revolution, because of course the revolution didn't begin in 1776, but it began earlier, and it is only now that they are actually declaring independence, because previously they had given the olive branch petition in order to negotiate with the king for to create a synthesis of the two sides and to amend the ills and the issues that have occurred. However, the king has refused to negotiate and has instead chosen to wage war. So this is what they are referring to at this point, that their demands have been rejected by the king and that the king is now going to fight them. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of desolation and tyranny already begun, with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of the free people, nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of their common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity, which is to say, of common ancestry. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world, which is the God that they referred to at the start, for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So ultimately, what we notice here is that the main offenses, most of these are offensives against their liberty and by extension their pursuit of happiness or property, if you want to go the other direction. The actual offenses against their life only occur towards the very end, when they're talking about the part where they have already rebelled, and therefore the king is now waging war against them. So I just want to point that out to make it very clear what exactly the distinctions that are being made, and to which of the unalienable rights they are appealing to. So now comes the part where I give my particular ideological opinion and expound on my particular interpretation of these things, because I do not generally agree with John Locke on some of these issues. So I'm going to, or Thomas Jefferson, for this particular matter. So I'm going to explain a little bit of my conception of justice. Now, I say that justice is only possible under authority. Now, you may say, why do you say that? Well, while individually speaking, if an individual were an island, an individual would indeed be his own arbiter. But then the question arises, what if two individuals, perhaps acting in their own interests, end up in conflict? So the conflict, therefore, has to be resolved by some means. Now, there are a few different ways for the conflict to be resolved. They can be resolved through cooperation, through one individual, one party having authority, through a third party having authority, or through violence. But ultimately, all of these types of resolutions require that one party of some sort should acquire some sort of power, and through power exercise the authority to bring into fullness the justice. So ultimately speaking, there's no justice without authority, and authority is decided can only be enforced through power. And therefore, I take the particular position that might makes right. Now, that might sound a bit unpalatable to classical liberals. However, I'm going to explain a bit further, because the actual writers of the Declaration of Independence, while taking a liberal stance, do by some token also agree with me in a sense, because they make an appeal to the creator here, and at the bottom they also make an appeal to the supreme judge for the rectitude of our intentions, which means that they believe that the actions that they take are correct, because rather than following the authority and power of the king, they are following the higher authority and the greater power of a God, who therefore by his higher authority justifies their actions, because through his higher authority he gives them the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then logically it follows that if someone violates rights that are unalienable, then it is up to the people to overthrow the government and therefore to replace it. So the question, then, the difference of opinion between me and them, I and them, to be exact, then comes here. Are these rights directly endowed by the Creator, or are they in some ways are these unalienable? Are these rights unalienable? That's another question to ask. So I take the particular position that from a classical realist standpoint, when it concerns states, it obviously makes sense that a state would want to avoid its own dissolution and its own destruction, or its own disintegration, or its own segmentation and alienation of segments of the state. So it obviously makes sense that in the interests of Britain should not lose the colonies. So from an international relations standpoint, that is something that is realistically accurate. Now, when it concerns justice, we have to go a bit deeper into the question. If there is no justice without authority, then in theory, opposition to such authority which exercises the justice is indeed an opposition to justice in itself, and by virtue of what justice is, it is therefore evil to oppose an authority. Now, of course, when I say the appeal to the creator, I'm not necessarily saying that that's the only thing that, from a realistic perspective, is possible, because the particular values of a government may not necessarily be based on particular religious values, but could simply be partisan in nature. But I would say that rights in general and justice, in my particular opinion, is not something that is naturally derived, in the sense that I would believe it to be a bit of a naturalistic fallacy to assume that rights can be indeed natural. But instead, I think that in the context of religion, the strength of the rights and the strength of the enforcement of justice is, of course, determined by the power of the God in question. And of course, in the particular Christian context, the God has all power, and therefore it makes sense that he has all authority over the whole universe. However, in an irreligious or a religiously neutral context, it makes sense to instead base them onto particular partisan ideas that are floating and therefore socially constructed, because otherwise they would not really be justifiable from nature. But that's just my particular opinion on how ethics can be formed. But ultimately, by the idea that there is no justice without authority, that places the idea of ethics within the hands of government. Now, in a religious context, of course, the highest ethicist is the God that judges everyone and therefore exercises jurisdiction onto every person as an ultimate judge. In an irreligious context, it would be the state. So I do have to maintain, from my perspective, that the idea of might makes right is accurate, because otherwise I would not be able to justify ethics at all. So then the question arises, when is it acceptable to rebel against the justice that is being enforced by the state or by the government? Now, you may ask then, what about jurisprudence when it concerns Britain? Because what we have here is an appeal to God in the particular context of Great Britain. And so you may say that although these individuals claim that these rights are self-evident, they have not expressed the self-evidency of such rights. Because I could simply ask, what gives you the right to live? What gives anyone the right to live? What gives anyone the right to equality? What gives anyone the right to freedom? Why should anyone be allowed to pursue his own happiness? These are all questions that, though they may sound silly to some, are legitimate questions that an ethicist should have to answer. So now it makes sense to characterize this in the context of the culture from which this is derived. So first of all, the context would be in that of English common law. Now, there aren't many cases where a king is being accused of tyranny. However, I recently, in preparation for this video, have read the transcript of the trial of King Charles I that occurred as a result of the English Civil War, where King Charles was raising taxes, and he was attempting to gain more power and to centralize the authority by working towards eventually uniting the crowns, which eventually happened anyway later on, but at the time wasn't considered very popular by Parliament. And ultimately, he did not find it agreeable to be with Parliament, and then Parliament began giving themselves rights by going into session and giving themselves additional rights, such as the right to self-convene every 3 years, and a number of other things without necessarily king's permission. And so now there was a situation where Parliament was attempting to increase its power, the king was attempting to increase his power, and they ended up going into conflict, and ultimately this led to the king losing a war, getting captured, and going on trial, and Parliament accused him of treason. Now, it's very interesting. What I find is that while he was still accused of treason, he was also still the king, which is something that I find very interesting, that they had not deposed him while he was being accused of treason. So the king then made an argument, and I actually find his argument very convincing. And he made this argument multiple times because of he was asked to plead whether he was guilty or not, or innocent, relating to his the particular accusations that had been made against him. And the king said that he did not recognize the authority of the House of Commons to act as a court of law, and that had no root in English common law, which is true. And he asked by which authority they were accusing him. Now, what's I also find very interesting is that they did not respond to his question, and they did not give a complete answer to it. And the king, therefore, ultimately made an argument for what is a very important legal principle, which is sovereign immunity, which is to say that the state, or the leader of the state, alternatively, cannot be sued or otherwise litigated against by any of his subjects, or anyone in general, without the permission of the state, of course. Now, you may ask you may say that this sounds a bit unjust, but ultimately, from a realist standpoint, it makes sense, because the most important interest of a state is to maintain its own existence, and therefore, for someone to sue the state and to attempt to defraud the state would be very silly. Now, of course, in the context of legislation, many states have allowed people to sue them, but the reason those people can sue the state is because they have been given the liberty to sue the state by the state itself, which holds the power to grant such liberty. So and King Charles did not grant such power and ended up being sued. So ultimately, then, what we have is a situation where King Charles makes a legitimate argument, in my opinion, for a legal principle which is applied by every country, because if countries did not apply the idea of sovereign immunity, it would be absolute chaos, because people could simply gridlock the government by just suing everyone in it. And at the same time, in Parliament's accusation and eventual finding the king guilty and executing him for treason due to tyranny, we have a legal precedent for what happens in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, that the House of Commons, in the interest of the people, or at least in what they claim to be the interest of the people, decided to sue the king himself and to exert justice on him who was by rights their sovereign. But maybe that's a discussion for another time. But I get back to the idea that this is not mentioned at all in the Declaration of Independence. The argument for which they make, as they don't make an argument based on common law or legal precedent. They make an argument based on natural law that is rooted in the religious culture of the British people. So I thought, why not take a look at the fundamentals of those. What do I mean by that? The fundamentals of this. Well, what I mean is that the king of Great Britain was, of course, by being the leader of Great Britain, was linked with the Church of England, which used the Book of Common Prayer, within which are the 39 articles of religion, and therefore there might be a theological argument to be made as to why it is justifiable for the United States to declare their independence. So I decided to look this up, and in the 39 articles, in Article 35, there's a mandate made to read the second book of homilies, the 21 homilies within it, the 21st of which is an homily against disobedience and willful rebellion, written by John Jewel, who was a bishop and a theologian at the time of Queen Elizabeth. So this is the theological statement from the Church of England in relation to whether or not rebellion and disobedience against the government is justified. So let's take a look at what it says theologically here. I'm just taking this as a part of the legal analysis as to whether or not it's justified. So, okay, so I'm going to look at this part here, because you can read the whole thing, but there are a couple of paragraphs that are of particular interest to me. So, first here, let's talk. The first out of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, and the 13th chapter, where he writes thus unto all subjects. So this is quoting the epistle to the Romans of Paul the Apostle in the Bible. And of course, this is from the Church of England. And of course, King George III is party to the Church of England. So it makes sense that this is the particular theological perspective by which he should be judged if an appeal to theology is made. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For princes are not to be feared for good works, but for evil. Wilt thou then be without fear of the power? Do well, so shalt thou have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God for thy wealth. But if thou do evil, fear, for he bears not the sword for naught. For he is the minister of God to take vengeance upon him that do evil. Wherefore you must be subject, not because of wrath only, but also for conscience sake. For this cause you pay also tribute, for they are God's ministers, serving for the same purpose. Give to every man therefore his duty, tribute to whom tribute belongs, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear belongs, honor to whom you owe honor. Thus far are St. Paul's words. The second place is in St. Peter's epistle and the second chapter. Okay, so and then it goes into another quote. So what we have here is in the Church of England's liturgy, in the book of Common Prayer, we have a particular reference to a part of the Bible where it talks about a divine right of kings essentially being ordained by God and demanding obedience, therefore, to such powers. Now, it is worth noting that this is, of course, the epistle to the Romans, so this is talking to ancient Christians at a time when they are under the pagan Romans, who recently at this time had established a form of autocracy and monarchy. So, and eventually would be persecuted as well by this. So that is the particular context of that. But then you might say, well, what if someone becomes a tyrant? Because this isn't necessarily saying that you shouldn't rebel against tyrants. That's not explicitly what it's saying. But you might also say, why is what the Church of England says relevant? Well, because this is before the UK had an official separation of church and state. So this is actually relevant in a semi-legal sense. Okay, but here's the other paragraph I wanted to talk about. What shall subjects do then? Shall they obey valiant, stout, wise, and good princes, and contemn, disobey, and rebel against children, being their princes, or against indiscreet and evil governors? So should you rebel against someone who's too young to rule, or someone who is generally a bad ruler or incompetent? God forbid! For first, what a perilous thing were it to commit unto the subjects the judgment which prince is wise and godly, and his government good, and which is otherwise, as though the foot must judge of the head, an enterprise very heinous, and must needs breed rebellion. So what they're saying here is that by placing the subjects, therefore consent of the governed, is categorically rejected by this statement, because, and the reason it gives is that it breeds rebellion, and rebellion being a form of disorder, and from a realist perspective, it makes sense to want to avoid rebellion, and therefore it makes sense that you should create a system of government that will resist rebellion at every turn. Because otherwise, you are essentially saying that the government is allowed to self-destruct, which is not something that anyone should say, at least from a realist standpoint, a standpoint of classical realism and neorealism as well. But I think that is worth saying now. For who else be they that are most inclined to rebellion but such haughty spirits? And you get people saying that if the U.S. Government were to take guns away, that that the people are going to just rise up and overthrow the government, and that would lead to a civil war, and of course many people would die, and of course that's an undesirable result for both the government and the people, and so what they're saying is that this would be destructive generally. For whom springs such foul ruin of realms? So they're saying it would be, from whom springs such foul ruin of realms? So they're saying it would be ruinous to the realm. Is not rebellion the greatest of all mischief? And this is also referring back to the Christian jurisprudence, the idea that evil can generally be classified as rebellion against God, and that therefore justice is the just punishment or reconciliation of that evil. So theoretically, they can define all ethics as matters of rebellion and obedience, which from a perspective of might makes right makes sense, or a perspective that there's no justice without authority makes sense. Okay. And who are most ready to the greatest mischief, but the worst men? Rebels, therefore, the worst of all subjects, are most ready to rebellion, as being the worst of all vices, and farthest from the duty of a good subject. As, on the contrary part, the best subjects are most firm and constant in obedience, as in the special and particular virtue of good subjects. What an unworthy matter were it then to make the naughtiest subjects and the most inclined to rebellion and all evil judges over their princes, over their government, and over their counselors, to determine which of them be good or tolerable, which be evil, and so intolerable that they must needs be removed by rebels, being ever ready as the naughtiest subjects soonest to rebel against the best princes, especially if they be young in age, women in sex, or gentle and courteous in government, as trusting by their wicked boldness easily to overthrow their wickedness and gentleness, or at the least so to fear the minds of such princes that they may have impunity of their mischievous doings. Now, this is the particular reason why the Declaration of Independence explicitly makes sure to mention that the rebellion is rooted in the authority of the Creator and of nature, because otherwise, if you purely were to say consent of the governed without making such qualifications, you would essentially be saying that if the people generally want rebellion, it's okay for rebellion to happen, which would be a terrible thing to say, a very terrible thing to say. However, I would say that their argument from the Creator also falls apart, theologically speaking, by looking at what is written from what Paul wrote and also what Peter wrote. And I generally agree with this homily on what is written here. So I do believe that this is indeed correct and just in an ultimate sense, to say that obedience to the state is itself a moral good, excepting if it violates a higher obedience to a deity. But if there's no deity, then the state is the highest authority and therefore is the highest justiciar and it exercises justice with its jurisprudence over the entirety of its jurisdiction rightly. So I would say that from a realistic perspective, the obvious point where this falls apart is in the case of someone whose very existence is threatened, in which case it makes sense that that person, for self-preservation, would rebel because their existence is being threatened. And a great example would be in cases such as genocide and things like that. However, there is no genocide occurring in the colonies, and the violence itself is only in response to the colonists and their rebellion and the fact that they did not surrender. So although elements of it are waged somewhat according to what is written in the Declaration of Independence, it seems to imply to me that they're accusing the king of waging a war of attrition against his subjects. I do believe that wars of attrition are indeed justifiable from a military context, but that's my opinion. I know that there's people that disagree with that. However, I do not believe that it is the king's intention to exterminate the entirety of the populace, and therefore I do not believe that the populace has a valid reason to rebel against the king, even if the king severely oppresses them and leads them into ruin, because to subvert the authority of the king would be the same as subverting justice itself, and would be a great evil. But that's my particular ideological position on that. So tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Oh, one more thing that I have to mention. I also, let me make sure I explain this. When I say I have a strong status quo bias, what I also mean is that if a state has already been established by its independence, as the United States has in this particular instance, and has therefore achieved its sovereignty, I do not believe that it is therefore unjust for a state to continue to exist if it has arisen through unjust means. Now, what I'm not saying is that the ends justify the means. I'm not saying that the state is therefore justified, that the beginning of a state is justified through an unjust rebellion. That's obviously not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the continued existence of a state is justified through its own jurisdiction, and that the establishment thereof is the questionable part. So let me be very clear. I'm not saying that the United States should cease to exist or that Britain should retake the colonies. That's not at all what I'm saying. Also, my throat is drying out, so I think I should probably bring this to an end. So tell me what you thought in the comments below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a philosophical argument against what I have said? Perhaps even a theological argument against my interpretation of the Christian theology in this particular instance? I would be happy to hear it, so please do so in the comment section below. If you'd like to discuss these issues with me, feel free to contact me. I would be happy to discuss this with anyone. Just make sure that you're persistent, because I might not see your initial contact request. Just be sure that you want to contact me, and I'll be happy to do so. In fact, I very much would like someone to contact me to discuss such political issues concerning political philosophy. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out. By the way, have a happy 4th of July.